Christopher Hitchens is a dying man. We'll talk about that a little more today on the Gary DeMar Show. Yesterday I talked a little bit about Christopher Hitchens, his background, his fuming against God, his fuming and raging against evangelical Christianity, particularly in relation to Jerry Falwell, and as well his book, God is Not Great. And I said that based on what he has said, the way he says it, and things he's said in an interview, I think he's playing an act. Maybe he is an atheist, maybe he's an unbeliever, but I think a lot of what he's doing is a public front, merely for the sake of taking the other side of an argument. Let me talk a little bit more about that mentality, the vacuity of an atheistic belief that drives people to put up rhetoric that is much more stringent than the case requires, especially in the case of Christopher Hitchens. At the base of Islam, for example, there's a well-known confession. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. It is what we take as a caricature of fundamentalism, of an idea where there is oppression, there is no side for doubt, there is no side for questioning, there is no room for asking questions about the faith. There is one authority against whom you cannot dissent. It is impersonal, and it is one voice for that authority, and you cannot question that one voice of authority. Outside of that, anything is damnable. Now, of course, Islamist Muslims may wish to qualify what I've said, certainly, but that's the way I see it, and it's certainly the way it comes across, especially since it's an impersonal religion. A law is more of a fate than a will. Now, atheists would say they abhor this type of dogmatism, and of course they would lump Christianity in with it as well, which is a whole subject of discourse. And against that type of dogmatism, they would prefer what they call free thinking. And obviously that's not an unwholesome thing in itself. I believe in freedom. I believe God has given us an entire range of freedom to ask an entire range of questions, even about his existence. And yet he has the power and the will to bring us to faith anyway. And yet many of these atheists who vaunt themselves as free thinkers immediately run into then this type of dogmatism on their own, where they believe miracles are impossible because they have adopted a series of presuppositions beyond the idea of just free thinking, asking questions. That's also a whole topic in itself. One only need recall the Marxist-inspired revolutions, the mass graves of atheism, if you will, in Russia, whom a lot of free thinkers today would try to say that's not characteristic of atheism. I would argue it's part and parcel. The mass graves of dialectical materialism, which was, of course, Marxist phrase for what he believed in. It is a fancy phrase, dialectical materialism. It is a fancy phrase for atheistic struggle, if you will, the atheistic fight, atheistic dialectics, which is only a step away from what Islam believes. You have an impersonal religion to which you have to submit. Your will doesn't matter. You're going to face it either way. For them, the idea of struggle is encapsulated in the word jihad. There really is not much difference between them except how they are carried out through law. We could just as easy say Marx's phrase dialectical materialism, which I've said is atheistic struggle, could also be termed atheistic jihad. Among atheists who inspired such slaughters stands one of Hitchens' former influences, a man named Leon Trotsky. And Hitchens mentions Trotsky in his book, God is Not Great, as Trotsky was talked about in the biography entitled The Prophet. Think about that. Put the things I've said together so far. Prophet carries with it a pejorative to the extent that it implies a voice of authority telling you what to do in the stead of God. And atheism says, I don't want that. But then it turns around immediately and places itself in that position that it places the individual in the form of God, and of course when it encapsulates itself in a society, it places the state in the place of the voice of God, and you have a dictatorship of atheists who rule as gods themselves. Whether it's individual or collective, the atheist is his own God. The creed of atheism can perfectly be set to parallel that of Islam with the creed, there is no God, and I am his prophet. Now, Hitchens tells us that he once admired Trotsky. He once admired Trotsky and was part of a particular sect of Trotskyites, but then in his later years was able to distance himself. He came to hold different views, and therefore he was able to change his views, and therefore he has something of the idea of what it takes to leave a cherished belief behind. And this, he assures us, gives him the moral sensitivity, so to speak, to understand the power of which faith has a hold on Christians. And of course what he's trying to say is if you just have the courage, you can throw off those old beliefs and become a free thinker. The problem is that when further interviewed on the topic, he says, well, I haven't really left socialism itself. I am still that much. And in fact, he says this about his old Marxist beliefs, referring to it, quote, as an idea I have not yet quite abandoned. And later in another interview, he says this, quote, I don't think I'd ever change my view that socialism is the best political moment humans have ever come up with. So it's clear to me that while Hitchens may have left a particular group of radical leftists, he has not left radical leftism itself. Now, that mental shift that he has made, whatever he can compare it to himself, and displays it as an example of intellectual bravery and sacrifice, hardly compares to what nearly every Christian has gone through in their life when it comes to the idea of repentance. Whether you've entered Christianity as an adult and gone through a radical conversion of your life, or whether you've been raised in Christianity from a child and have had to merely experience episodes of repentance along the way, or anything in between. That episode of repentance is far and beyond the mere thing Christopher Hitchens thinks he has experienced in changing his ideology, what little bit he has done. And I'm trying to say that this man is still the same old man. He is a man who's searching. He's a man with an empty soul covered by a tremendous capability of rhetoric and intellect. And yet he has never let that old man die and embrace the life that God has given us. Instead, he has waged war verbally against it. It is an act. Part of his act is trying to show Christians to be the unreasonable and the unthinking ones against his power of free thought. To this end, Christopher quotes Martin Luther in his book, God is Not Great. Martin Luther's famous phrase, which is always pulled out of context, that reason, quote, is the devil's harlot who can do nothing but slander and harm whatever God says and does. And the problem is that Christopher takes no time or pain to go to the history of that statement and to see the context in which Luther was talking. Long story short, Luther was not afraid of reason. In fact, he was more reasonable than many of his enemies at the time. He certainly didn't advocate irrationality. Rather, he saw simply that reason has limitations in the discourse with God. Reason is not an end in itself. There is no content to reason. Reason is a tool for humans to get from point A to B intellectually. The question is, what is the point A you're starting with? Reason can be moved, twisted, manipulated, put into any position that your lust desires, and thus it can reasonably, deservedly be called the devil's harlot. It is just as much man's harlot, by the way, as Christopher ought to acknowledge. Simply, Luther was saying that we are not able to engage in neutral search for truth in matters related to knowledge of God. Now that is a point. Intellectual neutrality is the issue. And I'm always willing to forgive an error. I am willing to forgive any simple error in reasoning or logic or whatever. But these types of errors that pertain to the ignoring of historical context, perpetuating unnecessary pejoratives, refusing correction, refusing to seek the truth. When these are repeated, these speak of a person who does not want to learn, but would rather dig into their own position more deeply to defend their own unreasonable presuppositions. Hitchens has joined that group, and it shows to me that it is atheism glorifying itself. It shows to me that it is nothing but emptiness, an empty soul glorifying, celebrating itself. It is a celebration of emptiness, what one might call a fair of vanity, a vanity fair. This is Christopher Hitchens' life. And Christopher Hitchens is a dying man, and I don't mean to make light of that. But all of the intellectual fig leaf that's been put over to cover that emptiness, to take whatever position he wants, merely to take the side of contrarianism for the sake of contrarianism, is an act, and the curtain is closing on that act. And it is time to look for some substance behind the mask of that actor. Thank you for joining me on the Gary DeMar Show.
For more related to this topic, check out God Is, How Christianity Explains Everything. You will find it at AmericanVision.com.